From the heart.org, Medscape Cardiology, this is the Bob Harrington Show. Dr. Robert Harrington is the Stephen and Suzanne Weiss Dean of Weill Cornell Medicine and Provost for Medical Affairs of Cornell University. This podcast is intended for healthcare professionals only. Any views expressed are the presenter's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of WebMD or Medscape.
Hi, this is Bob Harrington from Weill Cornell Medicine on Medscape Cardiology and the heart.org. As you know, we like to really try to stay current with timely topics in cardiovascular medicine, whether it's some new piece of science coming out in the literature, a clinical trial that's just been presented, or sometimes policy issues that affect both the practice of cardiovascular medicine or the research associated with cardiovascular medicine. Watching everything that's going on over the last couple of months with funding cuts at the NIH, funding cuts in other federal agencies that support research like the NSF, the DoD, I thought it would be a good opportunity to take two perspectives and have a conversation. One would be to hear from somebody who trains a lot of investigators, in this case, clinician investigators. And the second is to hear from a couple of early career investigators to see how they're thinking about these changes and how it might affect both their career choice or ways that they might be approaching their careers. I'm really fortunate to have with me my good friend and colleague, Dr. Adrian Hernandez. Adrian is a professor of medicine at Duke University, where he also serves as the executive director of the Duke Clinical Research Institute. Adrian has been on the podcast with me a number of times. So welcome back, Adrian.
Thanks, Bob, for having me.
I'm also going to put Adrian to work on this podcast and ask him not just to answer questions, but to ask some questions as well. Next up is Dr. Beth Feldman. Beth is a cardiovascular medicine fellow at Weill Cornell Medicine. Her specialty and her area of interest in which she's training is heart failure. So Dr. Feldman, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Last but not least is Dr. Henry Foote. Henry is a pediatric cardiology fellow who's just beginning his fellowship in intensive care medicine and also doing research training at the Duke Clinical Research Institute. So Henry, thank you for joining us as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Adrian, let's start with you. And you and I have talked a lot about this over the last couple of months. Since the change in administration, we've seen all sorts of challenges coming out of the federal funding scene. We've seen a proposal to cut indirects from the individually negotiated rates that we all have to a standard 15% across the so-called facility administration charges. We also see grants being terminated, grants being stopped, slowing down of new notices for application. You know, as somebody who runs a large research institute that depends heavily, but not exclusively, federal funding, give us a sense of the world from your vantage point.
The world certainly is changing, and it's been very dramatic, especially in certain corners of the U.S. where people weren't expecting the degree of change that is upon us right now. And we see it across all areas of science and research. And my hope is that, as we're going through those changes, it actually makes us think about, what is really core to our mission? What do we need to so-called double down here? And one of the things that's really important is that whenever you have these types of challenges, seeing how the community comes together to meet those challenges and do something really innovative in terms of our research. And also the topic related to today is actually ensuring the next generation thrives. And so that's really key right now.
As we think about this ecosystem, I'll call funding for biomedical research, there's been this longstanding relationship, contract, if you will, between the federal government and the research universities. But then surrounding that has been private industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the device industry, biotech industry. There's been the foundations, the Heart Association, National Kidney, Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and then there's been the philanthropists. You're at a place that for a long time has had a lot of different funding streams and has really purposefully tried to balance all of those. How are you thinking about this? You said new opportunities. Do you mean areas of science that maybe your group is particularly good at, or do you mean funding sources that maybe you need to shift to?
Well, both. So certainly, you want to continue advancing science that has become a really high priority. Cardiovascular disease is a high priority. It's a chronic health condition for which it's really clear that there's a greater emphasis in terms of addressing right now. We've seen the curve so-called bending the wrong way, and so we want to help that out by developing what's next and also implementing what's next. Now, the other thing is that, whenever you have this dramatic change, and a lot of it focused on, administrative efficiency or effectiveness, it actually is a good opportunity and asking the fundamental questions of, what is really important and what can we streamline? So there are a lot of reasons why certain processes, steps have been added to the research process. They're very well justified in the past, but times have changed. And so if you just think about some of the things that we have access to now that can make things more efficient, more effective, such as AI, for instance, to actually help us be more compliant, we should be able to take advantage of technology to do so.
One of the discussion points I've utilized on my trips to Washington over the course of the last couple of months is that if you look at the regulations surrounding the F&A, they've increased 160% in the last 10 years. And as you pointed out, I don't think any of it was malintended. It was just sort of one thing gets added after another. And one of the ways to cut down the indirect cost of doing research is to remove some of that regulatory burden. So I agree with you, Adrian. It's a great time to have those conversations.
Exactly.
All right, let's start in with our early career folks here. Beth, talk to us a little bit about what it is you're trying to do, what it is you're training to do, where you are in your training. I just generically said, a third-year fellow, but give us the real sense of what you're trying to accomplish.
I'm not at the end yet, but I'm getting closer to the end of my training. I went to Duke undergrad, but I was not pre-med in college. So I actually I was a consultant, a healthcare consultant for 3 years. So I got a kind of sense of the business world, then decided to go to med school, did a post-bac, and then after med school, did internal medicine residency at Hopkins. At Hopkins, got interested in cardiology. I'm now in my 3rd year of my general cardiology fellowship at Cornell. And then I'm starting actually a month from now, I'll be a heart failure transplant fellow. My ultimate career goal is to work in heart failure transplant. I also may end up even doing a critical care year after this so that I can be fully heart failure, critical care trained. My goal is primarily, honestly, to be a great clinician and then have research be a part of my general practice. I'm not doing a T32 grant, so I won't be a true, physician scientist, but my goal in terms of research has always been to be able to independently ask questions based on my clinical work and then be able to answer them with clinical research. So that's always been my goal.
So talk a little bit about the consulting experience. It's interesting. Over the years, I've met actually a lot of former McKinseyites and Deloitteites and Boston Consultantites who have come into medicine, and they bring a unique background. And are you interested, for example, in economics, in policy, or what is it about your consulting life that led you to medicine?
It was really the health policy side. I'm not really an economics person. It was really that when I started out in the consulting world, it was right when the ACA was passed, the Affordable Care Act. So a lot of my initial projects were large health systems that were trying to kind of grapple with what the ACA meant and how to reduce their readmissions and things like that. Medicine had always been in the back of my mind. I grew up with a father who was a physician, who's actually a physician scientist. And I'd always kind of thought about it, wasn't ready to take that step in college. And then once I actually started working with physicians and health systems, I realized, I don't really want to be doing PowerPoints and thinking about global health system issues as much as I want the authority as a physician to actually take care of patients. And then if I want to work on policy, I can do that on the side.
Good for you. Good for you. And we'll come back to this because it has some funding implications. Henry, now let me turn to you and give us a sense of your journey to get where you are and what you're interested in. And you're doing things a little bit differently in that you're actually doing a formal research fellowship.
Sure, great. And it's also, Beth, it's nice to know that other people are interested in doing multiple fellowships as someone who's pursuing two of my own.
There's more and more of us.
You can always add on more years of training. So I did internal medicine pediatrics residency at Duke and then stayed on for 3 years of pediatric cardiology training. And then am actually on a T32 this year. So that between Duke and UNC, there's a clinical pharmacology T32. So that's kind of supported my research for the year. And then DCRI has also a kind of a designated clinical research fellowship as kind of some didactic training and seminars. and then planning to get back more into the clinical world next year, doing 2 years of pediatric critical care fellowship. So kind of goal clinically is to work in the pediatric cardiac ICU after those years of training. And then I think from a research standpoint, really kind of focused on some kind of clinical pharmacology, some clinical trial design, working to improve outcomes in critically ill babies and children.
It sounds like we still haven't figured out how to dose drugs in children. It's Dr. not
We're
making
getting better, Bob. We're getting better. We
We're
have
getting better.
multiple FDA label changes now. So yes.
Yeah, I think we're getting up to 100. So hoping to continue that trend, especially as we get more kind of neuro drugs, kind of the biologic things that have been shown to have really good efficacy in adults, making sure we're carrying those over, kind of carrying over that benefit to the pediatric population.
So we heard from Beth that what she's interested in is predominantly being on the clinical side, but having an important component of her life that allows her to do scholarship. And what's your intention? Is it that mostly as a clinical person with some research, or is it mostly as a research? What are you looking at doing?
Still kind of trying to shape exactly what that looks like. I think right now my kind of next, okay, certainly the clinical training, and then I think looking towards applying for an early career award. If we can talk about what potential mechanisms that would be. I think the kind of the traditional network, I'm kind of going like an NIH type K award. I think looking at other industry sponsored career development awards as well, to really kind of fund the early years after kind of an early faculty to allow you to have a kind of your own research career.
If I remember, Adrian, you had an AHA Fellow to Faculty Award when you first joined the faculty. And what are you thinking these days, Adrian, for what makes a clinician scientist? If Beth and Henry are taking similar but not quite the same paths. And what do you think it takes to train someone to be a clinician investigator? And do you think that the current funding environment might influence how you think about that? My podcast last month was with Jeff Cooven and from the ACC, and we talked about what does it actually take to train a cardiologist these days?
Yeah, so I actually think one of the things that's been around for decades is those clinician investigators that come across a common question for which there wasn't an answer for, and so Bob, you remind me of my first grant, an AHA grant, which was around non-cardiac surgery. And when I was on the consult service, I saw all these heart failure patients who were making up answers in terms of providing recommendations in terms of how to handle their scenario going through non cardiac surgery. And actually, it was around that time, I was also reminded by someone we all know and admire, a mentor of mentors, Dr. Gene Braunwald. And when he was an intern, he would keep a diary of the questions that he would encounter that didn't have an answer. And so you actually see this commonly where people do that and then over their years are aiming to address those problems and still have that so called life in them all the time, saying that, hey, there's a clinical question that we don't really have an answer. Is it worthy to go answer it? And actually, I saw this today in rounds with one of our colleagues, Chris Granger, quizzing some folks and realizing that we didn't have an answer on something. And so I think that drives a lot.
Yeah, for me, it's always been one of the fun things of cardiology, which is that despite being a very evidence-driven specialty, the vast majority of the decisions we make all the time, as evidenced by the guidelines, are not supported by a terribly high level of evidence. And so I tell the fellows all the time, don't worry, there's plenty of questions that our generation didn't answer. And in all my years in the cath lab, I was never ceased to amaze me when you would ask some fellow, what are you interested in doing? They would throw out some question. And I would say, wow, that's a great question. How come nobody's thought of that before? So I do think that there's a lot of great questions out there. Beth, one of the things you got to figure out is how do you pay for your time? And, you got to go work for guys like Adrian who are
Or
very tough,
Bob.
very tough
I
taskmasters.
technically do work for Bob, I think.
All right. So you got to work for mean guys like me. And we're always wondering, how do you pay for your time? You mean your clinical time pays for yourself if you're a good doc and you're seeing patients, inpatient or outpatient, but your research time, you got to figure out a way to pay for it. How are you approaching that, Beth? And how are you thinking about it?
I think that's honestly what's kind of the most stressful and what's most uncertain for all of us, especially people who, like, even today, because I knew I was doing this, I was asking actually some of my colleagues who are doing T32s, what are you thinking? How is this going to affect all of us down the line? And I think, to be honest, no one really knows. For me, who's going to be doing research as more of like a side of what I'm doing, what will pay for me is going to be almost probably not 100%, but the vast majority of my clinical work. And I think for me, the research will be on the side. And if I need to apply for grants piecemeal as they come or as ideas come, I think that's what I will end up doing. If I end up getting into more research and I need less and less clinical time, that's going to honestly be more complicated for me going forward. Does what I end up doing, is there going to be industry support? Are there going to be additional grants I can apply to? I think it's going to come from everywhere. And I think just like no one knows.
Having that ability to tap into multiple sources is a useful skill. And for somebody like you who's interested in what I'll call health services, health policy, a lot of it is what you do as opposed to what a team around you does. And so there may be ways to be able to piece a lot of things together. Henry, how are you approaching this? You're on a T32 now, and you have certain obligations on the T32, but the big obligation is to get trained. Um, not a lot of deliverable in terms of solid research project, but more just get trained. How are you thinking of the future?
Yeah, and certainly looking ahead to starting my very clinically heavy ICU fellowship, thinking 2 years ahead when I'd be trying to start an early faculty job, kind of how to position myself. Sometimes you may get a couple of years of not protected time, but some kind of funding from your institution to allow you to work on grants and to get your own independent funding. There's a kind of uncertainty now in terms of how much flexibility institutions may have to have that kind of discretionary funding to support early faculty that may suggest that you need to come with a greater percentage of your own funding.
One thing you both touched on is like being able to address your own interests. And so one of the things that, grant funding, whether it's through federal funding, nonprofits, or industry, is it allows you to become your own boss. And so these days, that's pretty fun to have that chance to be your own boss for a certain part of your world.
Yeah, that's a good way to think of it. I often thought that the reason you get to do what you want to do is it depends upon how much grant funding you can bring in to protect that time, and that is the ongoing challenge. Adrian, what are you seeing in terms of T32s? We certainly have lost T32s here at Weill Cornell, including a very large one that's been going on for 40 years. We've appealed for reconsideration, but losing the T32 to me is one of the big blows because that affects the future. It may not affect today, but it affects the future.
Even before the last 6 months, you were seeing trends in T32s in terms of emphasis of new areas of science, how to incorporate innovative methods into training programs. And so we actually have lost T32s because they weren't there yet in terms of incorporating data science, for instance, or digital methods. More recently, there have been loss in T32s because a shift in federal priorities. Previously, some of the T32s, for them to be funded, they have to meet priorities at that time, and that's shifted. And so we've seen those changes now. We wait to see, what will translate into the future T32s or programs like that, because certainly the investment in early careers has a long trajectory of impact. Small changes there get amplified literally over decades. And so I think that touches on, one of your comments or worries about where things are right now.
Yeah, that's one of the things that concerns me the most. I mean, for example, we accepted less PhD graduate students this year, substantially less. And that's not going to create a problem today or even tomorrow. It's going to create a problem 5, 7, 10 years from now as the PhD science workforce is needed. And, at Weill Cornell, we're not alone. A lot of our peers have done that. I think you guys have done that, Adrian.
So, yes, so we have as well at Duke. And so that will have downstream implications. And that's one of the challenges around the so called serendipity of science. You don't necessarily know where the next discovery will come from. If it was that easily planned, then it would be a lot easier, but that's not the case. It's creative minds in the right time being curious.
Yeah, I like to call it curiosity-driven research because that's really what it is people just having an interest. And the example I've been giving all the time lately is the GLP-1 agonists, and you know, started studying them because people were interested in the metabolism in lizards. I don't think people that started out with that had an idea that these would be some of the most important drugs in current history.
That's right.
I'm going to ask each of you to close up, and with you, I'll start, Beth. The conversations about less funding, et cetera, uncertainty coming out of Washington affected your thinking in terms of the future? Stressed you out?
Yes, I mean, I would say yes, and I would say no. I mean, I think yes, in terms of, yeah, it is stressful. It is stressful to think about, what your future is going to look like. I think we all kind of, because we both have been training for, years at this point, we came up in a particular model, and now that model's changing, and so that's going to come with some anxiety. I would say no, in the sense of, I think we're all kind of not entrepreneurial in our mindset, but I think we are driven people, and I think if we want to get something done, we're going to figure out how to do it. So I think, when I have ideas, or when, I think we'll manage to get work done, and I think hopefully, research will endure, and we're all, we can get creative, but I think the anxiety is always going to be there because of all the change.
I like the idea of an entrepreneurial mindset, and I'm gonna ask Adrian
The
about that.
consulting in me.
There you go. I really like it. Henry, how about you? Is it changing your ideas about where you're going to be going in the future?
I think my main sense is that there's just tremendous uncertainty. So I think, like for me, having kind of 2 years of pretty good certainty that I'll be in clinical training, and I think kind of we'll see where we are after that time. So like I'm not having to make a decision now in terms of what the next 5, 10 years will look like. I think we'll have another couple of years to reassess. And I think you alluded to this earlier. I think that kind of being a clinician scientist, that I think the clinician part, I think, does give you a fair amount of stability, and so you're a little bit more able to tolerate uncertain other aspects.
Yeah, I
Um,
think that's right. I think that the clinician scientist maybe worries about this a little less, unless you're running a large research institute that's heavily dependent on federal funding. So, Adrian, how are you thinking about this? Entrepreneurship has always been a hallmark of the DCRI, and thinking creatively about funding has been a hallmark of the DCRI. How are you thinking about it for both the near term, and let's call it near term, the next 1 or 2 years, intermediate term, 3 to 5 years?
Over the years, have we really endorsed the concept of academic entrepreneurship? It's not an oxymoron. Actually, a lot of the most creative ideas actually start in academia. And so, how do we do that? So, in the short term, one of the things that we've been privileged is to answer the questions that are most important. We have a diverse portfolio of funding. And so, I think that's really good because if you're answering really important questions, it'll be of interest to many different types of funders. And so that's something that we are continue to so-called double down on. The second thing is actually thinking about what may be next. What may be funding areas that are really interested in highly creative areas of research or addressing really unmet needs. So ARPA-H is a good example of that. They have a very different mindset in terms of what they're aiming to do, doing so very rapidly. And so we're seeing what we can do there. So that's just an example of the entrepreneurship to a new area.
Yeah, I really like that thinking. It's similar to what we're trying to do here, which is number one, we're trying to figure out what are we good at and what should we double down on, as opposed to what do we like doing, but maybe we're not best in class at, and therefore should we double down on the things we are really good at. And the second is the diversification of funding. You've really got to be creative in this era and go after a lot of different types of funding. Though making up that federal funding gap is, I just don't think it's possible. We're going to have to think differently about what we do. It's too big a gap.
That's exactly right. So for sure, those kind of dollars, you have to be smarter and also thinking about, how do we become more efficient and addressing these different issues with different ways.
I love talking to the three of you because it also raises, as Adrian has said, where's the puck going to be? And the puck's going to be the burden of chronic disease. And all of us are working in that space. We want healthier children. We want less heart failure. And in my world, we want less heart attacks and acute coronary disease. We all have a lot of work to do. And I think there's great opportunity to play a role in that space. But I want to thank the three of you for joining. This has been a fabulous conversation. about early career clinician scientists and what the future might hold. I want to thank Dr. Beth Feldman from Weill Cornell Medicine, Dr. Henry Foote from Duke Clinical Research Institute and Duke University, and Adrian Hernandez, the director of the Duke Clinical Research Institute. Thanks for joining me. And if you've been listening to this or reading the transcript, let us know if it met your needs. Is it something that we should expand on? Is it something that you have comments on? Please do leave us a comment or a thumbs up if you really like the show. So thank you, everybody, and thanks for joining us here to the listener on Medscape Cardiology and the Heart.org.